So what's going on, guys? DIY Dan, and this is another Mechanical Backroads Arizona video. This is my new to me used 2000 Jeep TJ that I purchased recently. And in this video, I'm going to be replacing the fuel pump / sending unit that is in the fuel tank. The reason I'm doing this is because ever since I got this Jeep, the fuel gauge has not been working. So I am in the process of creating a diagnostic video where I show what wire colors do what going to that fuel pump and sending unit assembly, and I show how you can test for ground power going to your fuel pump, as well as bypass that sending unit to verify that it's not a problem with the gauge. It is the sending unit not delivering the correct signal to that gauge. And as soon as I'm done with that, I will have an icon at the end of this video you can click on to help you out. Now, another thing I had to do that I wasn't quite expecting is replace a plastic fuel line that goes from the fuel pump itself over to the line that is on the frame rail of the Jeep. And I did end up basically making this fuel line because I could not find it through the dealership because it had been discontinued, and I could not find it aftermarket either. Now, it turns out the reason I had to replace this fuel pump because the gauge was not reading, and the fuel line itself was because, unannounced to me, the previous owner had a little bit of a pack rat problem apparently, and the pack rats had actually chewed the wires right at the fuel pump, and had also chewed a little bit of the plastic away on the fuel line fitting plugging into that fuel pump. The other massive benefit I got to swapping out this fuel pump is when I first got this Jeep, I did think it was a little low on power for being a straight 6 4.0 liter engine, but since I'd never owned a Jeep before and this is my first one, I just didn't know. And after replacing this fuel pump, I went from that low power to being able to chirp the tires in second gear, so I was pleased with that result as well. Now, we are Amazon affiliates, and I will put the links to the parts and supplies that I used in this video in my description if you want to get any of them coming. And let's get to it. So the first thing I did was remove the fuel cap and take out the 4 Phillips screws that are holding the fuel neck to the actual vehicle. Whenever doing a fuel pump, this is always the first thing I do because once you get everything else done, it's very easy to forget if you leave it to the end. Then I went underneath the vehicle to disconnect the electrical and the fuel lines from that sending unit. In order to disconnect this plastic pigtail, you will need to pry it away from the steel bracket that it's held to. Now, my original intent was keeping this fuel pump for a spare. If I would have known that I wouldn't be keeping it, I would have taken a pair of dikes and cut as much of these plastic clips off as possible. Because these plastic clips are so old and stiff, they can be a pain in the ass to leverage off of that steel bracket. And if they're shorter, they're gonna pry out of there that much easier. In order to disconnect that electrical pigtail, there is a red plastic clip you will need to pull up and off of that connector. Then there is a tab that you need to push down while pulling on that pigtail in order to disconnect it. I do recommend this being one of the first things you do so you're not already frustrated with other things because this will take some patience. This pigtail is kind of in a pain in the ass spot to get to. Most likely this plastic's going to be very dry and brittle on yours just like it was on mine because it is over 20 years old, and you do need to be careful with it so you don't break that connection and have to replace it, or break off the locking tab and have it not hold tight and vibrate loose over time after you install the new one. Now, something that might make it easier if you're 100% sure you're not going to be hanging on to the old pump is I would recommend just pulling that pump harness out where you can cut the harness off of the actual fuel pump, obviously not the vehicle harness. And then once the fuel tank assembly was completely out of the vehicle, I would have went back underneath the vehicle and finished trying to get that pigtail unplugged from the vehicle harness when the fuel tank was completely down and out of the way, so I could get both hands up in there much easier because I'd have a lot more room to work. Because even though this process only looks like it takes about 10 to 15 seconds in the video, I actually spent probably close to 10 minutes trying to remove this stupid pigtail off of the fuel pump on this vehicle. Now, hopefully your harness comes right off and you won't struggle like I did with doing this. But I've had some come right apart, and I've had some that have fought me like this one did. So cutting that harness off of the fuel pump assembly is just another option for you, in case yours is being a fucking pain in the ass like mine was. After that, I went ahead and removed the fuel lines going to that sending unit. This was the second most annoying part of this process. So this is a clip after I obviously fully removed the fuel sending unit and pump from the vehicle, but it was much easier for me to show you how these fuel lines work with it out of the vehicle. So I actually used a pair of needle nose because of the room restraint right here. You can try and do it by hand as well. You'll notice that when you squeeze the end of that plastic, that the 2 tabs in the center collapse down as well. Those plastic tabs need to collapse far enough to get down past this lip on the fitting on your plastic fuel line in order to remove it. This enables you to grab the fuel line and twist and pull it off of the steel fitting. So right here, I'm just going to slide this fitting back on so you can see how it collapses the tabs as it pushes into place. And then you can hear the snap of those tabs going up to lock it in place. Whenever working with these type of fuel lines, you should always hear that detent, ensuring you that you've got it on correctly. Otherwise, the pressure that is on that hose when you fire your engine up might push it off and you end up with a big fuel leak. The other thing that can cause you a lot of problems when you're dealing with these type of fuel line connections is dirt, debris, and stuff like that being in those fittings, not allowing those tabs to collapse. So if you do have an air compressor, sometimes it's a good idea to try and blow those fittings out to get that debris out of there before trying to remove them, especially when you're up in an awkward situation like under this vehicle. The other thing that gave me some fits was the fact that these hard steel lines were pretty close to that plastic tubing, so there wasn't much slack or give in order to remove it. And for this reason, I didn't pull that line all the way off because of that. But I did get it, so I knew it was loose, so when I started dropping the tank, it would come off the rest of the way. Now that plastic tube is the high pressure line. There is also going to be another rubber hose that is just pushed over the top of another steel line, and that is for the evaporative system. So in order to remove that one, all you need to do is kind of twist that rubber hose until it breaks free from that steel line and then pull it back and off of that steel line. Once again, this was a tight fit and it was a little awkward without trying to bend those steel lines to get that hose off of there, so you do need to be careful. Now the emptier the tank, the better, because obviously it's lighter and easier to handle. I think mine was right around a half a tank when I did this, and obviously you're not going to have that choice depending on when your fuel pump actually took a crap, which is most likely the reason for you doing this. Now if this tank was empty, you could probably do it by hand. However, since mine was half full, I did use my floor jack, and then I put a piece of plywood on that to distribute the weight more evenly. Once you have something underneath that fuel tank, in order to support it, you're going to want to go around to the front of the fuel tank, and there are 3 nuts that hold that fuel tank to the framework of the vehicle. There are 2 that are very easy to get to, and then there's one more sneaky little around to the side a little bit, which I actually forgot at first and tried lowering the tank and was wondering why it wasn't going. I used a 13mm socket and a long extension with my 3/8 impact in order to remove these. If those bolts and nuts look really rusted out, I highly recommend using some type of a penetrating oil and let it sit for a couple minutes before trying to remove these. Once you have removed all 3 nuts from the front side of the fuel tank, then you're going to want to go around to the back side of the fuel tank, and there is a total of 4 nuts holding the back of that fuel tank to the frame. There is also going to be 2 nuts with long studs sticking out the bottom. Those are your fuel straps, and you do not want to remove those at this point. Now there is a couple reasons that I mentioned removing the nuts off of the front of the fuel tank before removing the back ones. The first one is they're more of a pain in the ass to get to, so it's just better to get those out of the way first. The second reason is once removing those back nuts, you do need to be ready to operate that floor jack or whatever you're using in order to support the weight of that tank. And the final reason is, and obviously the most critical, is you don't want to be in a vulnerable position that if you remove that final nut and that fuel tank slips off of whatever you're using to support it, that it doesn't fall on you or get you pinched under the vehicle. Probably not going to happen if this tank is empty, but if it's full, it's a whole nother story. Once removing all 7 of the nuts that hold this tank to the frame of the vehicle, you can go ahead and start lowering it down. Right there you can see that it was sticking on me. That's because I forgot that one nut. So then I removed that one and started lowering that tank down. Now as you start lowering this down, you will have to guide the fuel neck hoses kind of through the frame rail as you go down, because those are a pretty tight fit. Once you drop that fuel tank a little bit, you could theoretically disconnect the rubber hoses for that fuel neck at the tank. I just didn't feel the need to do that, and I just guided that fuel neck between the cab and the frame of the vehicle as I went down. Once I had that fuel neck out of the vehicle, I went in and put the fuel cap back on just so no dirt or debris would get in that fuel neck while I was changing out the pump, and then went ahead and slid that fuel tank out away from the vehicle so I could go ahead and change this fuel pump out. So when we first got this Jeep, I had suspicions that they had a pack rat issue and it sat for a little bit. And after pulling this fuel tank out, I realized they did, because there was a bunch of pack rat bedding material up on top of that fuel tank. So I took a shop vac out and got as much of that out as I could. Then I went ahead and decided to pull the fuel straps so I could completely remove the fuel tank from the skid plate assembly so I could clean it out further. Now, obviously, if you're not dealing with the pack rat issue like I am, you will not have to fully remove this fuel tank from the skid plate. However, you will still need to loosen these fuel straps a little bit, and I'll explain why later in this video. So basically, you're going to take that rubber cap off and then unthread using that 13mm socket until the nut is almost at the end of those studs on the end of those straps, and just leave it at that. And just like the nuts up in the frame, if those straps look like they're a little rusted, it's a good idea to put some penetrating oil on those. And you might even want to hold the straps themselves with a crescent wrench or a pair of pliers while you try and loosen them, so you don't twist or bend those straps while you're trying to loosen those nuts. Once I was done cleaning out that skid plate, I went ahead and slid that fuel tank back into place. Then at this point, I decided to remove the fuel pump from that fuel tank. So right here, I'm disconnecting that short plastic pressure hose from the pump assembly, and just like the one that was underneath the vehicle, I was struggling with this one a little bit, so I ended up using a screwdriver to help push those plastic tabs in. Once using the screwdriver to help push those plastic tabs in, then I kind of held those in place with my hand, and then also used it to help pry it away from the pump assembly. Now at this point, I didn't see any reason why not to put the fuel straps back into place and go ahead and tighten them down. However, that ended up being a mistake. And the reason is that actually squeezes that fuel tank a little bit when you tighten those straps down, to the point where it can make it more difficult to remove and install that fuel pump back into the tank. Now, a lot of fuel pumps these days have a spring-loaded mechanism, so it wouldn't probably bother that type of a fuel pump. However, this fuel pump is a fixed height, and therefore, when you tighten those straps down, it was actually collapsing that tank a little bit and adding some extra pressure to that fuel pump assembly, making it harder to remove the screw-on lid and harder to install. Now, I didn't realize this until wasting probably 15 to 20 minutes trying to reinstall this fuel pump and just having a hell of a time trying to get the screw-on lid back into place. Now, this could just be specific to my specific vehicle and my situation, but it's really not that big of a deal to take those extra two straps and loosen them up to eliminate the possibility of that being a problem. So this Jeep uses a plastic threaded ring to hold the fuel pump in place, and there is little ridges on the side of it. Now, they do make actual tools to remove this style of lock ring for the fuel pump. However, I didn't have one and I didn't feel the need to. I just used a flathead screwdriver and a rubber mallet to lightly tap those ridges counterclockwise in order to break it loose, and then I finished spinning it off by hand. I will put the link to that tool if you want to go ahead and get it coming, in case you're not comfortable with using the other method. Now, for whatever reason, that plastic lock ring did break because it's getting brittle, because this vehicle is getting pretty old. I did take the time to find that lock ring on Amazon as well, and that will also be in the description of my video. So whenever taking something apart like this, it's always a good idea to snap a picture real quick so you know the timing of it, even though this is pretty self-explanatory, because there is a recessed area in that fuel tank that lines up with the fuel line coming off the pump. Once you've got the lock ring off, you should just be able to kind of wiggle that fuel pump and lift it right up and out of the fuel tank. Now, you'll notice as I'm lifting this, the actual screen fell off of this fuel pump right down into the tank. Pissed me off. So then I had to get my little grabbers and fish that out of the fuel tank. Once fishing out that suction screen, then I went ahead and removed the seal that seals that fuel pump assembly to the fuel tank. Now, before going to install the new fuel pump, I did want to show you this because the old fuel pump and the new fuel pump both had this feature. You'll notice that the head of this fuel pump does swivel a little bit, and that will help you in case when you tighten down the new fuel pump that the fuel line connection on that fuel pump does not quite line up with that recessed area in the tank. So now we're going to install the new seal into the fuel tank before installing the pump. So this seal does have a little bit of a raised lip, and that goes towards the top of the opening on the fuel tank. So basically, you're going to put that seal in place in the fuel tank, and that lip is going to hold it there so it does not fall into the fuel tank. Now, because I didn't want you guys thinking I was full of shit as far as loosening up those fuel tank straps before installing this fuel pump, here is about 6 minutes of video condensed into about 25 seconds showing me fighting this thing, getting pissed off, throwing cuss words all over the place. Because of those fuel straps being tight, they were squeezing the tank a little bit, and I could not get that fuel pump into place, and that lock ring started because of it. So after fighting that for that amount of time, I went ahead and loosened up those fuel straps, and then was able to get that lock ring pretty much right into place and tighten it down. So when you're trying to get this lock ring into place, obviously you want to make sure that that rubber seal didn't push down into the tank. You also want to make sure you're timed correctly with the fuel pressure line coming out of that pump, pointed directly at that recessed area that is molded into the tank. And then the other thing is make sure you do not cross thread that plastic lock ring onto the tank. So you should be able to tighten this down 99% of the way by hand without using any tools. You'll notice that as I was tightening that by hand, it was kind of pushing the fuel pump with it. But then once stopping with the lock ring, I could push the fuel pump counterclockwise back and then tighten it with the lock ring again to get it 95% of the way tight by hand. Once tightening it as far as I could by hand, I did take my mallet and a large screwdriver and just give it a couple more taps to ensure I had a nice tight seal on that fuel tank.
So the line on my fuel pump that was messed up was a part number 521000218 Apple Charlie. However, I could not find this part number on Amazon, and I did try calling a dealership and they said it was discontinued. So at that point, I had to make my own.
Now what makes this line a little tricky is that it's actually a 3/8 quick coupler off of the actual fuel pump, and then the line on the chassis is 5/16. So since I was trying to get this done in a timely fashion, I actually went to AutoZone and Checkers, and both of them did not have a reducing line that would go from 3/8 to 5/16. So what I ended up doing is buying one of their kits that was 5/16 steel to 5/16 nylon tubing. Then I ended up going on Amazon and finding a 3/8 steel quick disconnect down to 5/16 nylon tubing, and I purchased that. So the first thing I ended up deciding to do was go ahead and cut the old tubing because I did like the little bit of insulation they had around the nylon tubing, and I wanted to put it on the hose I was making. So right here I'm just using a pair of loppers to cut that off and pull that insulation off. Then I fed that insulation over the new fuel line that I had purchased from AutoZone. Then I cut the new fuel line repair kit to the same length as the old hose that I was replacing. Then using a brake clamp tool, I went ahead and put it in the 5/16 slot and tightened that clamp down on the nylon tubing, and I tried to put it about a 1/4 inch past the total length of the hose barb portion of that plastic fitting and tighten the clamp down on that tubing. Now I did try to push it on just like that, but it wasn't going very well. So then I decided to get a little bit of grease and then put it on the inside of the tubing a little bit and on the outside of the hose barb portion of that fitting. Then I put the fitting in the palm of my hand and squeezed against the brake line clamp in order to press that fitting into that nylon tubing. I got it pressed on about halfway and realized I was fighting that clamp a little bit. So I ended up loosening that clamp up a little bit, moving it farther back on the nylon tubing, then continued pressing it on the rest of the way onto the fitting. And that's all there is to making that hose. So right here you can see that clamp didn't really do any damage to the hose, and I was able to get that nylon tubing pressed fully over the hose barb section of that plastic fitting. So basically I ended up having just under $40 into making this hose, and so far so good. We've been running it for over a month without a problem. I will put the links to the fittings and a hose repair kit that I found on Amazon that's equivalent to the one that I got from AutoZone.
So right here, I'm just putting the new fuel line that I made on the fuel pump. Make sure you hear that little detent snap into place,
telling you that that fuel line is fully seated onto the pump, and then give it a tug to make sure it doesn't come off. So right here, I just got the fuel tank back on the jack, ready to install, and I tightened back down those fuel tank strap brackets
and push those rubber caps that were on the threads of those straps back in place. I lowered that jack as much as I could to help get that fuel neck underneath the chassis of the vehicle, and then routed that fuel neck on the inside of the frame rail, and then slowly raised the jack as I maneuvered that fuel neck between the frame of the vehicle and the cab of the Jeep. Now this did take a little bit of time going back and forth from the jack to the fuel neck to make sure it was not getting pinched or caught. However, this is still way easier than trying to mess with those hose clamps and removing that fuel neck from the fuel tank in order to install this.
Keep an eye on your fuel lines and that electrical wiring harness to make sure you're not going to get it pinched while you're going up with the fuel tank. Once I had that fuel neck up where it was supposed to be and the tank pretty much up into place, I got the nuts started on the backside first. Once again, that's basically for safety reasons. If the jack slips in any way, shape, or form, I've got those 4 nuts holding the back of the fuel tank when I'm under the vehicle. Once I got all 4 of the nuts started on the back side, then I went underneath and got the 3 nuts started on the front side of that fuel tank, but I did not tighten them down yet. Once I had all 7 of the fasteners hand tight, helping support that fuel tank, then I went ahead and hooked up the fuel pressure line. Just like the one on the fuel pump, you want to make sure you hear the detent snapping into place telling you have it on correctly. Then give it a tug to make sure it is on correctly and it doesn't pop off. After connecting the pressure line, then I went ahead and just twisted that rubber hose for the evaporative system back over that steel line. Once the fuel lines were on, then I went ahead and plugged in the electrical pigtail from the vehicle to the new fuel pump assembly. When pushing those pigtails together, you should be able to hear a little bit of a detent, just like when you push that fuel line into place, telling you are all the way snapped together correctly. Once doing that, you should be able to slide that red locking tab into place on that pigtail. Now here's where I ran into a little bit of a hiccup with this fuel pump assembly I got from Detroit Axle. I could not get that harness snapped into the 2 holes on the skid plate to help hold it in place. I even got a pair of channel locks and tried to squeeze it in that way, but it just seemed like the retaining clips on the new pigtail harness on the fuel pump assembly was just a little bit too big for those holes. Now I probably just could have taken a zip tie and gone around that skid plate, around the harness, and zip tied it up there to hold it in place. But what I decided to do is go ahead and drill those holes a little bigger so I could snap it in correctly. You'll notice right here I've got the drill bit, but then I added a piece of hose to the drill bit, and that makes it so when that drill bit pushes through that steel, it can't pull that drill bit in and possibly damage something. It basically acts as a stop. And this is an extremely safe way to drill holes when you have to worry about something like a fuel line or an electrical harness behind something you're trying to drill, because it's only going to allow that drill bit to go in that far. Once drilling those holes a little bigger, I was able to snap that pigtail up into place as it should be, securing it correctly so there was no chance of it getting pinched between the skid plate and the tank and possibly causing a wiring issue later. After that, using my 3/8 impact, a long extension, and a deep socket, I tightened all 7 of the fasteners holding that skid plate to the framework of the vehicle. Once tightening the 3 fasteners in the front and the 4 fasteners in the back, then I went ahead and let the jack down and pulled it out of the way. Then went ahead and put the 4 screws that held that filler neck to the fuel neck bezel and tighten those down using my drill. I like to use my drill because I can set the torque setting on that drill and it prevents me from possibly stripping those screws out in that fuel neck. Then put the fuel cap on and then got my keys. I did cycle it to the on position a couple times to let it kind of prime that system and then fired it up. And what do you know, I had a fuel gauge that was working and a little bit more power than what I had before, as I had mentioned earlier. So that is going to wrap it up for this video, guys. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it and it gave you some good information. If so, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I'd really appreciate it. The whole concept of my channel is to give you guys the most information in the least amount of time as possible so I don't waste your time. I hope to see you next time. Have a good one. Later.